And we are live on YouTube, and let's let everybody in. Well, good evening, everybody. If you're just joining, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Welcome. If you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We'll get started in just a few minutes. And we'll give it one more minute and we'll start. All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Losack. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. Before we get started, let me introduce our staff. We've got with us our outreach director, Jackie Mashinya, our research and legislative analyst, David Mullins, our outreach coordinators, Emily Towie and Pat Beckham, our service intern this year for Governor Westmore's Service Year Program, WAHO, and our board treasurer, Josh Fisher, and of course, our special guest who I'll introduce in just a moment. Couple things. If you have any questions or concerns, please put them in the chat. Our staff will monitor them throughout this evening's discussion. We're also expecting County Executive Mark Elrich to join us, but his schedule, as you know, is more rock and roll than ours, so he'll join when he gets here. A couple things. First of all, it remains the Renters Alliance top priority to pass good cause eviction legislation, local enabling, this year. It has been multiple years in the making, more than 10, as far as I can remember. We were started in 2010, so I know that was something we've been pushing since we were founded. It has certainly gotten very serious in the last 6 or so years, thanks to the leadership of Delegate Janelle Wilkins from District 20. It has taken many forms, but at the end of the day, good cause eviction protection means that a landlord has to renew your lease at the end of the lease term with the same terms of the lease, except for a reasonable, hopefully, rent increase, unless there's a good reason not to. Right now, with just 60 days notice, a landlord can say they're not going to renew the lease. And then if you stay a day longer than the lease term, the landlord can take you to court to evict you for tenant holding over. We've seen a 100% increase in tenant holding over cases year over year in the state of Maryland as landlords take advantage of this way of circumventing due process to get rid of people they consider undesirable. Maybe it's because of their skin color, maybe their religion, maybe it's because they pursue promised or required services in their building, or maintenance, or code enforcement. Whatever it is, a landlord should have to say a justifiable reason to force someone out of their home. Without that protection, tenants live in constant fear of losing their home, and especially those who are not receiving the promised or required services or sustaining abuse from property managers or landlords. So the bill is pending again in the Maryland Senate. It passed 2 years ago, 96-37 in the House of Delegates, thanks to the leadership of Delegate Janelle Wilkins, Delegate Vaughn Stewart, who's on our board, and Mark Corman, the chair of the committee that got it through, and many other voices in the House of Delegates. It stalled in the Maryland Senate. It is in the committee called Judicial Proceedings Committee, chaired by Senator Will Smith, also of District 20. The voices in opposition to it are claiming that if they don't weaken rent stabilization around the state of Maryland, that they can't sustain a bill that protects renters any further. We adamantly disagree. We're going to need everybody's voices to speak up to this, to insist that this local enabling legislation, it's not even good cause protection. All it is it says to the local municipalities, if you would like this protection, you can enact it yourselves. Because eviction law is state law, so it has to require the state legislature to give the authorization to the local municipalities to pass it. So we're on this like crazy. We really cannot emphasize how important it is to have this protection. In our view, without sounding too extreme, but we don't believe there's a more important piece of legislation facing the Maryland General Assembly this year, except good cause protection and the budget, of course, more important. So there are lots of bills, lots of important bills, but no one single bill will impact more people than having the protection for nearly 40% of the state who rent their homes, not as a station on the way to owning, but as a permanent way of being housed. So very, very important to us. So with that, we have two very important guests. I'm going to first welcome our county executive, Mark Elrich. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the impact of evictions and housing instability on academic achievement. As many of you should know, we spend, and I'm sure the county executive will immediately say so, nearly half of the county budget goes to our school system in order to produce productive, tax-paying citizens who are happy and involved in whatever career that they pursue. When we destabilize people, students, and they are not able to achieve their full potential, not only does it hurt them, but it hurts the community at large. So with that, County Executive Elrich was a teacher before he was a politician and county executive. And before we get to our expert, Professor Peter Hepburn, we thought it would be a good idea to have the county executive give his opinion on housing stability and academic achievement as a former teacher. County Executive Elrich, welcome. You're on mute, sir.
Okay, you can hear me. Good. 2 nights in a row. So I guess I'm going to try to talk about this a little bit as a teacher. I want to go over just some basic things that we're dealing with right now. We've our completed evictions went from 254 in FY21 to 1362 in FY25. That's a huge increase in evictions. Montgomery County Sheriff's schedule about 4,600 evictions every year. That's more than 380 families facing eviction. Our shelters are already full. Homelessness is expected to continue to increase. We've seen it increasing. We have no reason to believe that it won't continue to increase. And our shelters at capacity, we can't wait until families are on the street to help them. We just enacted a new eviction law in the county that gives us additional time. Previously, the county wasn't notified when there was evictions. And I think it was like 5 days or some minimal number of days that a person had as a warning. Now the county's getting 2 weeks notice on evictions. And that gives our people the opportunity to either work with the landlord, and if we can't work with the landlord, to try to find alternative housing for somebody. And 2 weeks is way different. And, when a person gets evicted, they run the risk of losing everything. You don't only just lose your house, but if any of you, if you drive down the street and you see a bunch of furniture and someone's belongings out on the street, and that's where the landlords dump them. I'm thinking about introducing legislation to require them to put them in storage or to put a couple lockers on their property so they can store stuff there, because it's just absolutely inhumane. And if a person can't find somebody to with a truck, or a station wagon, or they still make station wagons, an SUV, sport utility vehicle. If you can't find somebody who can help you, that stuff sits out there. And if you're not staying there 24 hours, people rummage through your stuff. They will take your clothes, they'll take, good pieces of furniture. You've got good pieces of furniture. So you lose not just your house, but you lose things that, that are important to you, part of your life. And so the change in the eviction law, we think, is a big deal. And this whole thing is about, you lose everything. You run the risk of that when you're evicted. And that's especially destabilizing for children. When you think about, it's one thing for me to lose my favorite piece of art I had on the wall, or someone to grab a coffee table. It's another thing when a kid loses the toys and the things they identify with and they get some comfort from. That is a big loss. But evictions go beyond that. You get evicted, you go on the landlord list. There is a landlord list of people who've been evicted. And so when you go to another apartment building and you apply for an apartment and you show up on the landlord list of evicted people, you may not ever get that apartment. And there's no law prohibiting a landlord from using that information as the basis for evicting someone. And they don't know why, or not renting to someone. And they don't know why that person was evicted. They don't know if they're evicted for non-payment of rent. They don't know if they're evicted because they damaged the property, or they were evicted because they called the housing department and said, I've got code violations here and we need them enforced. When I was, first in political life in Tacoma Park, and I was on the council there, we had the best rent stabilization law in the country, I think. We strengthened the law that was, when I got elected, we strengthened the law that was in place, and we put a lot of protections in there, but we were never able to get just cause eviction. And it was a serious problem because in the old days, landlords, after you called the housing department, they'd write you nasty letters and say, I'm going to evict you. I'm not going to have you call in the housing department. Why are you doing this? All that kind of crap. So the state passes a law protecting tenants against retaliatory evictions. So it took landlords a couple of months to figure it out, but if all they did is keep their mouth shut and not write any letters, they could simply wait until 30 to 60 days before the lease renewed and just say, I'm not renewing your lease. So they lost the pleasure of being able to tell somebody what they were going to do to them, which I'm sure they got satisfaction out of. They weren't able to do that. But they did learn to shut up. And so retaliatory cases become harder and harder to prove, because as long as the landlord doesn't put it in writing that I'm mad because you called the housing department, and they don't do it verbally with you're having a witness, it's very hard to prove retaliation. It can be done, but it's not easy to do. And so the consequences aren't just, like I said, the moment of losing your housing, it's the fact that it could keep you from getting housing as you're going forward. This is one of these things that's like life sentences. And I feel the same way to some degree about, prison sentences and convictions for people. You could serve 6 months for something small, and this is especially bad for young people, and then discover that you're not going to be able to get a job again, and you're not going to be able to get an apartment because of your criminal conviction. And so now I've essentially sentenced you for life to a very difficult life, to a life where possibly the only path where you're going to see putting bread on the table is by picking a path none of us want you to pick. And so our society has ways of creating things that we think are punishments, but are actually long-term forms of torture for people, and really, really do have, serious impacts on that person's future. And so you might be mad at them in the moment. Somebody might have to, pay the price to society, so to speak, for something they did. But if they pay that and they, come out of jail and they're ready to work and they're ready to resume a place in society, we ought to give them that place in society. If somebody can't pay the rent, they shouldn't face a situation where they could forever be banned by landlords from being able to rent again. So that's really, one of the things that bothered me the most. And I was an elementary school teacher. The other thing that evictions do is they keep people moving. That means families never have a stable community. And, I remember talking to people in one of my buildings in Tacoma Park here, and when I was the council member in Tacoma Park, and we talked about how mobility keeps you from getting rooted in the community. So you don't make an investment in community. You're not joining the PTA. You're not joining a neighborhood association. You're not participating in civic life because you don't know if you're going to be there 6 months from now or a year ago. And a lot of people with rising rents, which is a little less of a factor in Tacoma Park because they have real rent control, at least for the moment. You knew that you could stay, but if you were put out because of rising rents, you learn very quickly not to get too attached to where you live. Don't make the investments. The kids have to meet new friends every year. It's one thing to do this once in a while. It's another thing to do it, every year. It's another thing to do it in the middle of the year. And it's like when you go to school and you walk into class and it's like, you're new here. Why are you new here? What's the kid say? My parents were evicted from where we lived before, and now we're living over here, and I'm afraid I'm going to get evicted again. These are things that we do not think of enough. Don't think about the consequences and costs to our community in the broader sense when we damage kids and their ability to have stable lives when they're younger. The other thing that's destabilizing is listening to your parent fight about money, which is often a cause of why they're going to lose their apartment, or just fight about what are we going to do. It is hard on adults. It's particularly hard on adults who themselves were raised under similar circumstances and don't have coping mechanisms for dealing with hardship because all they know is hardship. It's not like they've got lifetimes of experiences where, yeah, something bad happened, but I got through it and look where I am. It's more like, I had this happen 6 months ago. Now I'm dealing with this again. Now I'm dealing with this again. It is destabilizing for the adults. And when it's destabilizing for the adults, it's destabilizing for parents. So when we do things, we've got to think about the whole impact of what we do, just not here's an issue with rent and here this person's getting evicted and that's the end of the story. That is not the end of the story. It's not the end of the results. And we've got to think of a fairer, better way of dealing with this. Obviously, evictions has a racial complexion to it. The Black community is disproportionately impacted by evictions, true nationwide, true in the county. In our county, our Black population, somewhere between 18 and 21%, depending whose numbers you're using. But they account for 45% of people who got COVID emergency rental assistance, which tells you how much of the Black community was vulnerable during COVID. The county's new eviction law is going to disproportionately benefit Black and Latinx residents who face the greatest risk of eviction. But both those groups are at the top of those who face eviction in the county. I signed Expedited Bill 3125 into law in December because it was vital that we protect tenants and prevent homelessness. Time is a defining factor in evictions. When you're facing evictions, every day matters. And Sheriff Weed told the council that this extended notice will actually reduce the number of evictions that they have to carry out, because when tenants have time to act, they act. It's one thing if you've got 2 weeks and the county government can help you, then there is an off-ramp to your condition. It doesn't deal with the long-term problems, but it offers you the hope of getting housing. But if you're put out and you've got a few days notice and then you're out on the street and weren't able to arrange for things, it is a serious impact on people. So we're hoping that 2 weeks, it lengthens it. I see the number, it lengthens it from 6 days to 14 days. And we're optimistic that 8 more days is the difference between being able to access rental assistance or losing your home, or finding your belongings on a curb, or your belongings in storage, or in the best circumstances, your belongings being moved into your new house. The new law wasn't just about providing notice, it's also creating a system to prevent homelessness. So we were cognizant of how this buffer in time can be the difference between a person winding up homeless or not. Right now, our services tend to prevent homelessness, which is sometimes here referred to as SEF, and the F is PH, not an F. Doesn't know who's about to be evicted until it's too late, usually, and this will change that. And their lack of access was one of the things that made it hard to deal with. Also allows our Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs, or OLTA, to provide mediation services and homelessness prevention assistance. Sometimes with mediation services, if we find somebody or a way of helping pay the tenant's rent, we can get the landlord to withdraw the eviction notice. But again, you got to have time for these things to play themselves out. So we believe this is going to help our people do their work to prevent homelessness better. It's going to reduce the number of people who wind up homeless, and it's going to connect tenants with rental assistance, legal services, and relocation support. I signed the historic countywide rent stabilization bill into law in 2023. Rent stabilization limits increases to inflation plus 3%, capped at 2%, capped at 6%. Historic rent increases before the bill were between 2 and 3% a year for over 20 years. Why the council insisted on adding 3% to this, I do not know. The law allows a landlord whose profits or income doesn't meet what they were making before. If their expenses exceed inflation, they can come in and get an increase to an amount that matches inflation. This is taken from the Tacoma Park law when we put it in place. It kept us, and for us, it meant being allowed to keep rent stabilization at Tacoma Park, because we had lost a court case where the court case found that our law was arbitrary and capricious because we had no strict guidelines or formulas that said what rent increase you could get. So landlords are getting different rent increases. You could have the same situation and two very different increases. A lot of it had to do with the Landlord Tenant Commission's sense of the landlord, how aggressive, nasty, or mean he was, probably got him a lower rent increase. A judge said we had to change that or they were going to invalidate the law. We changed it. We created a system where, accountants rule the day, and that's a good thing in this case. Basically, the landlord has to open up their books. They demonstrate their costs exceed expenses. They get an increase that matches it. And I've got to say, I had to sit back and swallow 17% rent increases when it was warranted. But you can't have a fair system if you don't at least acknowledge that you can't make people lose money. That would be a taking. And then when our law was considered a taking, we would have lost the law altogether. So while I shook my head when that happened sometimes, I also knew that the alternative would be that nobody would have rent stabilization. And, what I wish is that we could figure out a way to not do that by requiring landlords to maintain adequate reserves. Oftentimes, when a landlord gets in the situation of needing a 17% increase, it's because there's a major capital project that they haven't done, like a roof or an HVAC system. In the American tax code, you get this thing called the depreciation allowance. Depreciation allowance allows you to depreciate off your taxes the value of improvements over the lifetime of an improvement. So for a building, I don't know if it's changed, but building back then was 30 years. So you're depreciating your building 3% a year. Refrigerators, I think, were somewhere around 7 to 10 years. HVAC systems could be over 10, and the roofs could be 15 or 20. And you're taking the depreciation. You're getting a tax credit for that. And the whole point of the depreciation was for the landlord to take that money, which they got from the depreciation allowance, and create a fund to pay for the roof when it was time to replace the roof. But since we're in America, where justice rarely occurs, that most landlords take the depreciation allowance and put it in their pocket. That just increases their profit. And then they come crying when they don't have any money to fix their building because it's deteriorated, as if the tenants are the blame or their own, misuse of the tax code is to blame. So in my dreams, we go after the tax code and we require landlords to, take the deduction, but also to create funds with the money they get the deduction for, or invalidate any rent increases they get if they haven't done that. I mean, I get extraordinary circumstances. You could have an air conditioner fail in 5 years instead of 15 years. Wouldn't have put money away from that. But there ought to be a way of making this fair. And that's just one of the great challenges we face is how do you make stuff fair and how do you make it work better?
So County Executive, a couple things.
Yep.
One is, do you really not know why it is that they made 6% on the rent stabilization bill?
Do I really not know?
I
I
think you
know
know.
why.
That's one. Two, circling back to your experience as a teacher before
Yeah.
we move to Professor Hepburn, um, did you see students who had to move out of your class?
Oh, hell yeah. Yes. I mean, so I taught in a school that was fed both by Tacoma Park and by outside of Tacoma Park. And so you saw less of that for the people who lived in Tacoma Park, and you saw more of that for the kids who were outside of Tacoma Park because there were no protections outside of Tacoma Park, and Tacoma Park had protections. So you'd have a kid in your class, and then they wouldn't be there anymore, or you'd have a kid in your class who wasn't there, a month before. And it was always my parents moved. Most people try to time their moves to the beginning or end of the school year, but we were getting stuff in the middle of the year. And you could tell by both the parents and the kids that they were really stressed. Yeah, it's a real thing. And like I said, I saw that and I saw hunger. I saw kids whose last hot meal was lunch on Friday at school and didn't have another hot meal until breakfast in school on a Monday. And all those things make it hard to learn. It is just hard for young people who cannot understand the world. And if they did, they probably wouldn't be comforted too much by it anyway. And are dealing with stuff they cannot manage. They watch their parents not being able to manage it. And it is just destabilizing. That's the best word I can think of using for it. It destabilizes the child. It's hard to learn.
So, I mean, your direct experience is you saw less academic performance out of these students.
Less academic performance, less positive social behavior,
Mm-hmm.
because they don't want to explain their situation to everybody else.
Right.
This is not something that makes them feel good. So there's no good outcome that comes from this.
Mm-hmm.
We just ignore the things that aren't outside. Is this a landlord tenant issue? Is this an issue of money? It's an issue of so much more.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, County Executive, for joining us. We thought it was important for you to come on not only as County Executive, but as a former teacher who's had direct experience with students impacted by housing instability and evictions. And I'm sure you'll appreciate the fact that we brought on an expert from the eviction lab at Princeton University, a professor at Rutgers, who has written on this topic and multiple times and has not just an opinion, but facts to go along with them. And so if you're done with your remarks, County Executive, we'll move on to Professor, and thank you.
Okay.
We'll move on to Professor Peter Hepburn of Rutgers University and a research fellow at the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. Professor Hepburn.
Thanks so much for having me. And I want to thank County Executive Elric. I mean, so much of what I'm going to say, I think, really directly echoes what you just said about the destabilizing effect of eviction cases for, that don't stop. That doesn't stop at the limits of an apartment. That doesn't stop in landlord tenant court. This has ripple effects out into communities, into schools, into all aspects of our lives and lives of people around us. I think I'm going to back that up with some numbers here, but I think the county executive really laid out the central argument very clearly for us already, which is that when kids are going through that, they're in no position to learn, and they're in no position to really be productive members of that school community. So, with that being said, I'm going to launch into more of a presentation here, but I really appreciate having the voice of somebody who's been in the classroom and taught kids who are going through this. So I'm gonna share my screen here. I am going to present some findings from a study that I led with a team of researchers from the Eviction Lab, looking at how these eviction cases that kids are going through do really affect educational trajectories in a variety of ways. And we're going to focus, what we focus on here in the study, are data from the city of Houston, and we'll talk about sort of why that is. But I think the findings are likely generalizable to a whole range of other parts of the country and kids who are going through this nationwide. I want to start though by just explaining what the Eviction Lab is for those of you who are not familiar with it. We're a research group that's based out of Princeton University. We were founded and continue to be run by Matt Desmond, who many of you might be familiar with from his book Evicted. So that book was an ethnography of eviction and of families going through the eviction process in the city of Milwaukee in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And really, I think for many of us, helped to make clear and vivid the experience of these families and the sort of trauma and destabilization that eviction causes in their lives. But coming out of writing that book, Matt was really wanting to understand whether what he observed in Milwaukee was what was happening everywhere across the country, or whether this was unusual, whether this was sort of an outlier case. And at that point, we didn't really have, there really weren't good data available that could tell us, how many eviction cases were being filed nationwide. We just did not have numbers for this. The federal government did not collect much in the way of eviction data at all, and they continue to not collect very much eviction data. And the states really vary in how much data they make available to the general public or to researchers to try to understand the prevalence of these cases. So Matt launched the Eviction Lab in 2018, and our goal was to answer 3 questions, basically. So the first one is just, how common are eviction cases? Where is this happening in the country? How many families are going through this? And who is it that's going through it? And then the second question is, what are the causes and the consequences? What's driving this around the country, and what effect does this have on families and the individuals, as well as their communities, when we see more eviction cases in certain parts of the country? And then finally, what can we do about it? What are the policies that could make a difference here? And that includes policies like what the county executive was talking about, extending the notice period so that people have more time to find resources, to get emergency rental assistance, to get help from family or friends so that they can pay rent and can avoid that eviction case. Over the course of the last, I guess, 8 years or so, we've produced a whole lot of data and a bunch of research. I encourage you to go visit our website, evictionlab.org. There are data that are available on eviction rates for every single county in the United States from 2000 through to 2018, as well as real-time data that we've been collecting on eviction filings in 10 states and 34 cities around the country since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we have the number of eviction cases that were filed in Philadelphia or the state of Delaware or New York City last week, and you can see how these trends are changing over time. So one of the findings that has come out of our research during this period is a picture of who it is that's going through the eviction process, who these households are, and who's living in those households. We can now estimate that about 7.6 million individuals nationwide are threatened with an eviction case every single year. County executive talked about the racial disparities that you observed in Maryland. We see the same thing nationwide. About 18% of all renters nationwide are Black. Over 50% of all eviction filings are against Black renters. And the other group that bears a really disproportionate share of eviction filings are families with kids. Families with children face eviction filing rates that are twice as high as households without kids. And what that means is that when you look at the full population of people who are facing an eviction case every year, 40% of them, almost 3 million people, are kids under the age of 18. So we've got an enormous number of kids who are potentially at risk of losing their homes because their parents are getting filed against for eviction. Now we do also see seniors who are at risk of eviction filing. Little less than 200,000 renters a year, age 65 plus, face an eviction filing. But when we look at the eviction filing rate across the age distribution, the pattern is really stark. And I want to show you what that looks like. So this is a plot that shows eviction filing rates for women on the left-hand side and for men on the right-hand side, broken down by age group. So you've got kids 0 to 4 at the bottom, all the way up to people who are age 80 plus at the top of this plot. And the larger the bar, the higher the eviction filing rate. And what I hope jumps out at you right away here is that the 4 bars at the bottom here, for people who are age 20 or less, or under age 20, they face the highest eviction filing rate of any group within the population. This is a critically important age, and an age where, unfortunately, all too many kids are facing the risk of an eviction case, or their parents are facing the risk. So we've done a bunch of research, and others have done a lot of research to try to understand what effect these eviction cases have on individuals and on families. And a lot of this research has been focused on the adverse effects for parents or for adults generally. We know that these eviction cases are not just a consequence of poverty, but also a cause. We see that eviction cases increase the risk of losing your job. They increase the risk of seeing your income decline further. They, resulting hits to people's credit scores. They increase the risk of homelessness. Like the county executive was talking about, tenants get blacklisted. They end up unable to find new housing because every time they go to apply for an apartment, the landlord will see that eviction case on the record and refuse them housing. So it sets up this pattern of housing instability. And we also know that it leads to really negative health consequences, both physical and mental health, for people who've been through this process. But there's been a lot less research to date, at least, on the effects of these cases on kids. And what we wanted to look at in this study was how these eviction cases disrupt kids' educational trajectories, their process through the school system. And to try to answer that question, we turned to Harris County, Texas, which is the greater Houston area. And we collected data on all of the eviction cases that were filed in Harris County between 2002 and 2016. And all told, that's almost 730,000 eviction cases. It's 50,000 eviction filings a year. So there's no shortage, unfortunately, of eviction cases that are being filed in Harris County. Overall, the eviction filing rate for the county during this period was 8.1%. What that means is there were 8 eviction filings for every 100 renter households. To put that in national context, the average across the nation for the same period was 7.8%. So Houston is pretty typical. It's right about at national average, and in many ways I think is representative of what we would tend to see elsewhere. We're going to focus on the effect of an eviction filing in particular. What effect does it have when your parents get filed against for eviction? So we also do some analysis looking at the eviction judgment itself, but we think that there's probably a negative effect that's happening even earlier in the process when that case gets filed, even if it goes on to be dismissed. So to look at the results of this case, we turn to data from the Houston Independent School District. And we've got access to these data through a partnership with researchers at Rice University's the Houston Educational Research Consortium. And they've provided us access to data for all elementary, middle, and high school students for this same period. And so it's a big school district. It's the 7th largest in the US. And there are a lot of students who were enrolled during this time, almost 700,000 of them. And for all of those students, we see their enrollment, all of their standardized test scores, every time they were absent from school, every time they got suspended from school. We have data on all of this stuff. And we know, because of how enrollment works in the Houston Independent School District, the parents have to reregister every fall, which means that every fall we're going to know who kids are living with and exactly where they're living. And that's going to be really useful, because what we do is we match eviction records to those registration records. So we take eviction records, which are going to have things like dates, defendant names, defendant addresses, and we're going to link them to the registration records that have parent names and parent addresses. This is not a perfect science. If we had social security numbers or unique identifiers, all of this would work a lot better. But we're going to do, we did as well as we could given the data that were available to us, and knowing that these are messy data on both sides of the equation. So what did we find? So through this match, we identified 18,000 kids who were enrolled in the Houston Independent School District who were matched to an eviction filing against their parents. About half of those resulted in an eviction judgment, and half of them didn't. That doesn't necessarily mean that the family stayed in a unit. They may have just moved before a case reached a judge, and it was still an instance of displacement. But we've got 18,000 cases here. A lot of, a surprisingly large number of these kids had their parents filed against for eviction more than once. About almost a quarter of them faced multiple eviction filings, many of them within the same academic year. And you can think about how destabilizing that might be for kids. Overall, the matching that we use ends up being probably too conservative. We're missing kids whose parents absolutely were filed against for eviction. But in these cases, we're very confident that there was an eviction case for these kids. So what did we see for these kids? Overall, very little difference in the risk of eviction across ages. So, second graders, seventh graders, 10th graders, they all saw relatively similar eviction filing rates, or that their parents did. So it doesn't seem to matter where you are in the school trajectory. We did see very large racial disparities. So about 30% of students in the district are Black. 70% of the students whose parents were filed against for eviction were Black. We also saw elevated risk of eviction for a couple of groups that we haven't been able to document before. Kids who were enrolled in special education programs, their parents were more likely to be filed against for eviction. Also, those qualifying for free or reduced price lunch, who might be economically disadvantaged to begin with. So one of the things that the county executive was speaking about earlier was this issue of kids disappearing in the middle of the year or suddenly appearing in your classroom, right? This is one of the things we wanted to see. Do we see more mobility among kids whose parents are filed against for eviction? So we looked at these school changes. What we found was that for kids whose parents were filed against for eviction, about 12.3% of them made a school move within the academic year. And that's way higher than what we see for kids who don't face an eviction filing. There, it's only about 4.7%. We also see a lot more moves between schools between academic years as well. So 20%, 1 in 5 of the kids whose parents face an eviction filing, they switch schools before the start of the next academic year. That compares to 1 in 10 for kids for whom there is no eviction filing there. We also see a lot of kids just drop out of the district entirely. They're not in the records the next year. Almost 30% of the students whose parents face an eviction filing don't appear in the records, compared to 17% for students who are not facing an eviction filing. The other way to think about this is to turn it on its head. What are the odds that a kid is still there in the same school next academic year? For kids who face an eviction filing, less than half of them are going to be there in the same school next academic year. Whereas for kids where there's no eviction case filed, it's 70%, more than 70% of them are still present. We can also think about, when you're making one of these moves, are you moving to a different kind of school? What we found is that when kids are making a school move after an eviction filing, they tend to be moving to schools that have lower overall funding levels, lower standardized test scores, more economically disadvantaged students, and just much higher attrition rates. So more mobility within the school already, and you're sending a kid into a situation which churn is sort of the expectation. And that's another situation where learning is just that much harder when there's more turnover in the classroom and teachers and other students are constantly having to adjust to new kids coming and going. The last thing we wanted to look at, or we did look at in the study, was what effect we see on absences and suspensions. And I'm going to show you a couple of plots here to demonstrate these effects. These plots can be a little hard to interpret, but I'm going to try to walk you through it. So what we're comparing here are kids whose parents are filed against for eviction and kids whose parents were never filed against. And what we see is that before the eviction case was filed, so these bars that are over here in blue, these kids had roughly the same number of absences as kids whose parents never face an eviction case. But in the year when kids' parents are filed against, the year 0 here, and where the color switches to orange, there's this big jump upwards where there's an increase in absences in the year in which an eviction case is filed. And that tends to go down over time, and we see that difference disappearing over time, but there is a sizable jump in the number of absences that kids experience in the year when their parents are facing an eviction case. Now, we did the same thing with suspensions, and in that case, we don't see the pattern. There's no signal here. All of these confidence intervals, they all overlap with 0. This is one of those null effect stories that kind of got us curious. So we looked at it a little bit more closely, and we tried to break this apart by whether kids with an eviction filing, were they making a school move or were they not? What we found when we started to break it apart by that school move status was when we look at kids who have an eviction case and a school move, so this leftmost panel here, we see a big increase in suspensions after that point when they've faced an eviction case and they've moved schools. And that effect doesn't just happen in the year of the case. It happens and it persists every subsequent year where we have data. We continue to see those kids having more suspensions from school 5 years after their parents faced an eviction case. Now, we see a similar effect of an increase in suspensions for kids who move schools, even if there's no eviction case related to it. But the effect size is a lot smaller. And yeah, we don't see it having quite as big of an effect. So overall, if you're thinking like, what are the takeaways here? We see that eviction cases were pretty concentrated among relatively disadvantaged students. And we also found that they were relatively concentrated in certain campuses too. So there's certain schools that are hit particularly hard by these problems. The students who were facing eviction were just a lot more mobile than their peers whose parents weren't filed against for eviction, more likely to switch schools, more likely to end up in schools that by a lot of metrics are just worse off or just have a harder time operating. And they're more likely to drop out of the system entirely, just to not be there. We find that they're experiencing more absences, and for those who switch schools, more suspensions as well. So those are the kind of the key takeaways of the study. And again, I think this really lines up with what County Executive Elric was talking about and the sort of lasting destabilizing effects of these cases for kids. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm happy to take any questions if folks have them.
Just let me jump in real quick because the correlations, obviously point to other correlations that may not be in your study, but seem obvious to me. And going back to why this is important for public policy, but I'm sure there must be a correlation in terms of crime statistics among youth. That if they're not in school, if they're suspended, if they're not doing well, if they're angry, they're frustrated, increased mental illness impacts. Do we have any data on that?
That's a good question. There have been some studies that show an association between crime rates and eviction rates. I think it's important to think about what the causal direction is there too, and how much what's driving those patterns. And I don't want to. I've not been a lead author on any of those, so I don't want to speculate.
Folks, if there are anybody who are listening to this and you have a question or concern, please put it in the chat. Can executive or staff, do you all have any questions for Professor Hepburn? I have a question for County Executive Elrich, since he's stuck around. We did go to the superintendent of schools some years ago. I think it was Jack Smith. Was that his name? I forgot his name. And we sat down and we asked if they would do a study on housing instability and academic achievement, and they were loath to do it. They didn't want to, I believe he said at the time that if they found a correlation that the county council might shift money from the school system to some other public program. But I still think it's very important that since the county pays nearly half of its budget on our stellar school system, to see what might be the problems with some of that cohort of students who are not achieving as well as they should, to find out why. And see what, and define the problem and see what we need to do about it. Any thoughts on that?
I think about this a lot. I mean, I've always encouraged people to tell me everything I need to know, into whether or not it means I might have to make different decisions. You can't make right decisions if you don't know everything that's at play. And I get the school system's reluctance because in my world of budgets, there's a finite amount of money. And if one side goes up, something else goes down, and there are things that are sacred, and so they're not going to be touched. And so when you look at my $7 billion, there's a very small part of it that's actually has much fungibility to it. And so there's a real reluctance to learn stuff or discover stuff that would force you to act. I've never taken that position. I prefer to know what I need to do and then figure out how I try to get there over time sometimes. And I tell people who work for me, and people come and ask for money, I don't want to know that you're going to save 40 people. I want to know what the real need is. Even if I can't give you everything, I need to have a sense of what it is you're up against. So as I think about how you go forward, or how I frame things in talking to residents of the county, it's important to tell them everything. Not just I funded this nonprofit this much, that nonprofit, aren't I great? You're only, great is actually solving the problem. I may be helping, but I want people to know that with everything we do, we're not getting where we need to go. So I wish the school system had taken the approach that better to be honest and you not be able to do everything, but at least let people know what you need, than to pretend everything's okay. And I will say this year, with their capital budget, they asked for, I think, $2.6 billion. They know it's a 20-year ask. And that was largely because they had misled everybody about the state of repairs in school buildings. But they misled everybody because they looked at the county council and they saw, we're going to do $300 million for capital projects. Our biggest need in the school system at the time was expansion of capacity for a growing population. So capacity competed with repairs, capacity won. Now we're at a point where enrollment's declining and the focus is going to shift back to repairs and improvements. But that's unfortunate. And I told them, I said, if you had raised this from the beginning, people would have had to thought about our bond capacity. You might not have been able to raise everything, but you probably would have wound up farther than you are right now. So
if I may, there are schools that are trying to think really proactively, or school systems that are trying to think proactively about what they can do to deal with this. And either through their own programs using McKinney-Vento funds, which are for homelessness prevention for kids, for students, or in partnership with local public housing authorities. So for instance, in Tacoma, Washington, they established a program of specialized housing vouchers for families that were experiencing housing instability, families within the public school system, that is, that were experiencing housing instability. There are school systems, I think in Rochester, Minnesota, that have hired on housing navigators to help families who are experiencing instability getting back on their feet, finding housing, because they understand that this is like a critical need to keep their schools functioning well. And that obviously that expands the scope of what schools are forced to do, and that's a big ask for them. But it reflects that this is a kind of a key institution that a lot of kids are interacting with, and where the safety net needs to catch kids who are experiencing this sort of instability.
I think the world is also catching up, or at least our country is beginning to understand that housing is not just a common commodity on the market, but actually is central to the health, welfare, and prosperity of communities, and is an indicator of all types of other social impacts. And so without stable housing, you're not going to have a lot of things, and you're also going to have a lot of costs that are related. We saw when we visited our colleagues in San Francisco to see what they were doing. They had an interesting program. Maybe Emily or Jackie might remember it better, but I thought they said that they had a law or a policy that you couldn't evict during the school year. Does anybody remember that?
Yeah, that is what they said, that it was either for teachers or for students. So if there was someone in the household who worked as a teacher, or there was a student in the family, they could not evict during the school year. But it they could, like, in the summer months, but not during the school year. And it was for this purpose, to keep kids in schools and limit that displacement.
Yeah, obviously it doesn't solve the whole problem, but it was, a step at least to mitigate the disastrous impacts. Let me say to a couple people in the chat, if you have an individual case that you'd like us to look at, you can contact us at info@rentersalliance.org, and we'll take that on. We work with the Housing Opportunities Commission all the time, and we can certainly take a look at your case and deal with that. And Karen, Mark is good at this data, but he's not the head of the housing department. I can tell you that I don't know what the percentage of evictions are for condemned or for properties being bought by new developers. Mark, do you have any idea?
I don't know those numbers.
I don't either. So, but we can get back to you, and we can certainly look to that. We deal with the DHCA, Department of Housing and Community Affairs, all the time. It can look that up for you. Any other questions from our audience in the chat? All right. Well, we do something. Sorry, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I was struck by this. This is a little in the weeds about the actual kind of filings they do in Texas, but that 23% repeat filings, that's something that when we are, making our outreach lists, we're pretty taken aback by here too. Just how many there are, and we chalk some of that up to here. We have, in Maryland, the summary ejectment. It's a summary proceeding only about rent. Lawyers are chipping away at that a little bit and getting shoehorning things in, but right now it's really only about rent. And we think that's part of, Matt calls it kind of like using it like a collection agency almost. Then is there a similar summary filing in Texas, or is it?
No, I don't believe. I am not a lawyer, and I should probably not be quoted on this, but I don't believe that's the case. But we see these serial repeated eviction filings throughout big swaths of the country, especially the southeastern United States. Places where the eviction filing process is cheap because the filing fees are low, places where the notice periods are really low. So Texas has a 3-day notice period for an eviction case. So you've got to give your tenant 3 days. Landlords in Texas have written, most of the leases that you're going to find written in Texas are going to exempt properties from that. So they'll write an exemption into the lease saying that they don't need to provide any notice whatsoever, and they'll file immediately once rent is past due.
Wow.
And then if somebody wants to be able to stay in that unit, they're going to have to pay back rent, and they're going to have to pay back the filing fee that the landlord filed to the courts. And yeah, we unfortunately we see that all the time. And 25% in Texas is high, but we will see numbers 35-40% of households that are facing eviction are facing repeated evictions in other parts of the country.
Wow. Well, thanks.
Well, I want to thank County Executive Elrich, as always. He has been a renter champion since before we got formed back in 2010. And so he is an expert on this, and I know his heart is with us on getting these renter protections in place with good policy and thoughtful consideration of the facts. And of course, I want to thank Professor Peter Hepburn from the Eviction Lab, and please pass on our best regards to Matt Desmond for his work in founding that organization and bringing this data to light. We appreciate both of you. The Renters Alliance is available for anybody who has any concerns about their living situation in rental housing in Montgomery County and now also in Prince George's County. And of course, we are working in the Maryland General Assembly during this period to get good cause eviction, local enabling legislation passed. And we are looking for everybody to stand up with us and let your voices be heard. The Renters Alliance, every town hall will provide some information on available resources. So I'm going to turn to my staff now and let them go through what we know is available for you so you know. Who's next?
Thank you all.
Thank you, County Executive.
Take care.
Thank you.
And thank you, Professor. It
Thank
was
you,
really
Professor.
helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here.
I'm glad you were here.
So I'm going to start off with the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. So they are charged with informing the public of the general rights and responsibilities of tenants and landlords, and will help resolve disputes amicably. So you can call 311 or go to their website to access the materials such as the Landlord and Tenant Handbook, Ordinary Wear and Tear booklet. But they also, you can file any complaints to the Office of Landlord and Tenant on their website as well. But before filing a complaint, we recommend that you should, try to work with your landlord. And if that doesn't work, you can reach out to Renters Alliance for help as well, and then proceed with the complaint. After the complaint has been filed, you will receive an acknowledgement letter within approximately 10 days, where there will be an investigator who will be a neutral party that's going to examine all the documents and in view of both parties, determine if there has been a violation of the law in the county. And if the dispute cannot be resolved, then it's going to be escalated to COLTA, which is the Commission on Landlord-Tenant Affairs. And then that higher commission will accept the case and hold a hearing. And then just a part of that, underneath ULTA is also code enforcement. The Office of Code Enforcement will handle maintenance and structural violations. So if your unit has issues such as pest infestation, there's no heat or air conditioning, you have excessive mold, your pipes are leaking, you can also call 311 or submit a complaint online. We always recommend that you initially put in a maintenance request and give your management team ample time to address and fix the issue. However, using your best judgment, if it's like an urgent violation, such as there's no heat and it's winter, then that should be corrected immediately. If it hasn't, then you should file a complaint online. And also, it'd be best to reach out to Renters Alliance if you need guidance or you have any questions on how to get these issues rectified. But also, if you live in the Rockville, Gaithersburg, they have their own code department, and it's best to reach out to them. Tacoma Park has a contract with the county, so it'll fall under county code. And that's it.
Thanks, Wa. Well, on the topic of talking about evictions tonight, I'm going to talk about a resource for people, which is the Access to Counsel in Evictions. So if you are facing eviction and you have received a court summons for court, either for failure to pay rent, for tenant holding over, for breach of lease, you can and you should contact one of the legal aid providers. You can either call 211 to do a coordinated intake and be directed to one of the providers, or you can call the providers directly. And the three in this area are Maryland Legal Aid, CASA, and Community Legal Services, which just expanded over from Prince George's County. So I'll put all that in the chat. So these are pro bono attorneys who can represent low-income renters who are facing eviction. It's recommended that you call them as soon as you get that court summons, so you can share your paperwork with them, give them more time to prepare a defense for your case. They can possibly represent you at your court hearing, maybe get you continuance, or maybe even get it dismissed based off the evidence. We're not lawyers though, so you want to call them and talk to them so you can get your options. Now, because they are pro bono, sometimes they are limited in their capacity. So if they can't represent you, I still recommend calling just to get legal advice. They also do have same day representation down at the court in Rockville sometimes. Um, so the attorneys will be at the end of the hallway. And if you weren't able to get in touch with someone before and you're there for your court date, you should definitely make sure you bring your summons with you, bring your ledger, bring all your files, keep it in a folder so you can go share that with the attorney and do a quick intake there with the paralegal. But again, you can imagine that that doesn't give them much time to prepare a defense for you. So the sooner you can get in touch with them, the better. And we'll put all of their information in the chat.
Yeah, didn't they say, Emily, can you call 211 when you get a notice of intent to file now, the 10-day notice?
Is that
I think we had heard that. So I'm gonna yeah, I think the 211 hotline for ACE has been expanding slowly and they have a little more capacity. So yeah, even that early, try to reach out if you can.
yeah, sooner the better for sure.
Yeah, let's talk about eviction filings. I mean, a lot of these we've just seen a high number of improper eviction filings. They're filed for utilities or they're filed for the housing authority, HOC's, portion or something like that. So a whole number of reasons to have a lawyer take a look. So thanks, Emily. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. And I'll just say one more thing about that is that even whether you have a lawyer or not, you should always attend court. Even sometimes we hear from people who say, "Oh, well, I know I owe it, I can't pay it, so I'm just not gonna go." It is really important that you go. Like I said, maybe you could meet with a same day attorney, get a continuance, get you some extra time to pay. Um, or maybe there's a mistake in your case, whatever it may be, you don't have any chance of fighting that if you don't go to court. When you don't go to court, the judge will automatically issue a judgment in favor of the landlord. So you lose your opportunity to make any kind of claims. So we always recommend you go to court, and with a lawyer would be even better.
And even if it's not going to go well for you, sometimes just out of the leniency of the landlord, they might say, we'll give you some more time. So it's very important that you show up.
Okay, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Matt. I also wanted to remind everyone that the Renters Alliance is here to help you start your tenants association or to help you strengthen your tenants association. All you have to do is just reach out to us at info@rentersalliance.org, or you can just give us a call. We're also available to do tables or talks at community events that you would like us to participate in. So always feel free to reach out to us. We're available at any time to provide that information and that assistance as well. Thank you.
Great.
And Pat?
Yeah.
Good evening, my fellow renters. As always, Matt explained at the beginning of the session how important just cause is. So please always vote number one and try to find out which legislator in your district believes in just cause. That's very important. As Matt said, that's the number one problem we're facing as renters right now. So please vote and vote for someone who has renters' well-being in their agenda.
And by the way, we got plenty of those buttons. We just ordered a bunch of new ones this year. So if you'd like I'm a renter and I vote button, which causes many elected officials to take notice.
Yes.
Get in touch with us. Send us a note at info@rentersalliance.org with your address, and we'll get buttons to you. If you got a tenants association, invite us to your meeting. We'll bring some buttons and everybody can have them.
Please remember, that's our really only good weapon, voting. It's important, people.
Absolutely.
Please vote.
Josh, any last words from our board treasurer?
No, I just want to echo what everybody says up here and appreciate the staff and the great job and the outreach that they do and all of you guys out there. We're happy to Again, answer any questions at info@rentersalliance.org. And with that, I turn it back over to you, Matt. Thanks.
All right. Well, that's Josh Fisher, our board treasurer, a renter, community activist, and a champion for renters, of course. Otherwise, he wouldn't be on our board. So thank you very much, Josh Fisher. Thanks, David Mullins. Thanks, Emily Towie. Thanks, Jackie Mashinya. Thanks, Hua Ho. Thanks, Pat Beckham. Thanks to all of you for participating. At least we're not outside. It's freezing. But we're on Zoom and things worked out just fine. So thanks to our panelists, Professor Peter Hepburn, and of course our County Executive Mark Elrich, a renter champion. And to all of you, good night.